What paramedics heard inside the abandoned highway tunnel. The call came in at 2:07 the morning. At that hour, the highway running through the mountains was usually empty. Most drivers had already passed through hours earlier, and the few who remained were just trying to reach the next town before dawn. So, when the dispatcher answered the phone, she expected the usual things, maybe a stalled vehicle or a minor accident. But the man on the line sounded different. He sounded nervous. Not the kind of nervous someone gets after hitting a deer or running out of gas. This was the kind of nervous that made people lower their voices without realizing it. He told the dispatcher he had just pulled over beside an old highway tunnel a few miles outside town. The tunnel had been abandoned for years. Concrete barriers blocked the entrance, and large warning signs told drivers to stay away. Most people barely noticed it anymore as they drove past. But the man said he had stopped for one reason. Because he thought he heard someone screaming. At first, he assumed the sound was coming from his radio. But when he turned the radio off, the voice was still there, faint, echoing from somewhere inside the tunnel. The dispatcher asked him to repeat what he had heard. The man hesitated for a moment before answering. "I think someone's trapped in there," he said. He explained that when he first drove past the tunnel, he thought he heard something strange through his open window. So he slowed down. Then he heard it again. A voice, weak, almost swallowed by the echo of the tunnel. "Please, help me." The man said he pulled his truck onto the shoulder and walked closer to the concrete barrier blocking the entrance. For several seconds, he just stood there, listening. The tunnel was completely dark. His headlights barely reached the inside walls. But then the voice came again. This time it sounded closer and more desperate. That was when he called emergency services. Normally, a report like that would go directly to the sheriff's department. But because the caller believed someone might be injured, emergency medical services were also dispatched. That's how two paramedics, Ethan Cole and Marissa Grant, ended up driving along that quiet mountain highway in the middle of the night. Both of them had worked overnight shifts for years. They had responded to car accidents, injured hikers, and more strange situations than they could count. But when the dispatcher read the call notes over the radio, Marissa glanced toward Ethan. "Did she say the old tunnel?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "I think so. Almost everyone in the county knew about it. Years ago, the tunnel had been part of the original highway that cut straight through the mountain. But when a newer road was built nearby, the tunnel was closed and eventually sealed off. Over time, water damage and falling rock made the inside unstable. Engineers eventually declared the structure unsafe. After that, concrete barriers were placed at the entrance, and the tunnel was officially abandoned. No traffic, no maintenance, no reason for anyone to go inside, which made the call they were responding to feel strange. "If someone's actually in there," Marissa said, "how did they get past the barriers?" Ethan shrugged slightly as he steered the ambulance through a long curve in the road. "Maybe someone climbed over them," he said. But even as he said it, neither of them sounded convinced. The ambulance continued down the empty highway for another few minutes before Ethan slowed the vehicle. Ahead of them, a set of headlights sat parked on the shoulder. That had to be the caller. Beyond the truck, the dark outline of the mountain rose above the road. And carved directly into the rock was the tunnel. Large concrete blocks sat across the entrance, just like the county had installed years ago. Faded warning signs hung from metal posts nearby. Ethan pulled the ambulance to a stop behind the truck. The driver stepped out immediately. He looked relieved the moment he saw them. "You heard it too?" he asked quickly. "Not yet," Ethan said calmly. "Why don't you show us where you were standing?" The man walked them toward the barrier. Up close, the tunnel looked even darker than it had from the road. The inside swallowed nearly all the light from their flashlights. Marissa stepped closer, shining her beam across the cracked pavement just beyond the concrete blocks. Dust covered the ground. Loose gravel, small pieces of rock that had fallen from the ceiling years ago. She scanned the entrance carefully. No fresh footprints, no signs anyone had climbed over the barrier recently, which made the situation even stranger. The driver pointed toward the darkness. "That's where it came from," he said quietly. Ethan stepped up beside the barrier and raised his flashlight. The beam stretched into the tunnel, but quickly faded into shadow. "Hello?" he called. His voice echoed loudly down the curved walls. Then, everything went silent again. For several seconds, the three of them just stood there, listening. Marissa was about to suggest waiting for law enforcement when something made her freeze. At first, she thought it was just the wind. But then she heard it again. A sound deep inside the tunnel. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakably human. Help. Marissa slowly turned toward Ethan. You heard that, right? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He was staring straight into the darkness of the tunnel, listening carefully, because now the voice came again. And this time, it sounded closer than before. The voice came again. Help. This time, there was no doubt about it. All three of them heard it clearly. Marissa slowly lowered her flashlight, staring into the darkness of the tunnel as if expecting someone to step out at any moment. But nothing moved. The inside of the tunnel remained completely black. Ethan exhaled slowly and reached for the radio clipped to his vest. Dispatch, this is Unit 14, he said. We're at the old Ridgeway Tunnel. We have a confirmed voice coming from inside, requesting law enforcement and fire rescue for structural support. A pause. Then the dispatcher answered. Copy that, Unit 14. Deputies are on the way. Ethan clipped the radio back onto his vest and grabbed a larger flashlight from the ambulance. Marissa already knew what he was thinking. You're not seriously going in there, she said. Ethan looked back toward the tunnel. If someone's hurt, we don't have much choice. Technically, the tunnel had been closed for safety reasons. The ceiling inside had been declared unstable years ago. But if someone was trapped in there, waiting outside wasn't exactly an option either. Marissa nodded reluctantly. Fine, she said, but we stay close to the entrance. The driver watched nervously as both paramedics climbed over the concrete barrier. The temperature changed the moment they stepped inside. The night air behind them had been cool. Inside the tunnel, the air felt colder and damp. Their footsteps echoed loudly against the curved concrete walls. Marissa swept her flashlight across the ground. The pavement was coated in dust and small rocks that had fallen from the ceiling over the years. Every sound they made seemed louder than it should have been. Even their breathing echoed. Hello? Ethan called. We're paramedics. If you can hear us, answer back. His voice rolled down the tunnel and slowly faded. Then silence. They walked forward carefully. 10 yards. 20. The entrance behind them was already shrinking into a pale rectangle of light. Marissa suddenly stopped walking. Wait, she said quietly. Ethan turned. What? Marissa crouched down and pointed her flashlight toward the ground. There were marks in the dust. At first, they looked random, but then Ethan saw it too. Footprints. And they weren't old. The edges were sharp, fresh. Ethan followed the direction of the tracks with his flashlight. They didn't lead toward the entrance. They went deeper into the tunnel. That's not good, Marissa muttered, before Ethan could respond. Please, the voice again. But now it sounded much closer, somewhere ahead of them. Both paramedics froze. Marissa slowly raised her flashlight toward the darkness. Hello? She called. This time, the answer came almost immediately. A weak groan echoed down the tunnel. Ethan moved forward faster now. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness until it finally reached something lying on the ground about 40 yards ahead. A shape. A person? Over there, Marissa said. They rushed forward. A man was lying on his side across the cracked pavement, his clothes dirty and damp with dust. One of his legs was twisted at an angle that made Ethan wince immediately. Hey, Ethan said, kneeling beside him. Can you hear me? The man blinked slowly when the flashlight hit his face. His lips were dry, his breathing shallow. Thank God, he whispered. Marissa immediately began checking for injuries. The leg was definitely broken, possibly the hip, too. How long have you been here? She asked. The man shook his head weakly. I don't know. Ethan frowned. What do you mean you don't know? The man swallowed painfully. I woke up here, he said. Marissa glanced down the tunnel behind them. Did you fall? The man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly lifted a trembling hand and pointed deeper into the darkness behind Ethan and Marissa. Down there, he whispered. Both paramedics turned their flashlights toward the direction he was pointing. The beams stretched down the tunnel, but they didn't reveal anything, just empty pavement disappearing into shadow. Marissa looked back at the injured man. Is someone else down there? The man nodded slowly. At first, I thought I was alone, he said. But after I started yelling, he hesitated. His eyes shifted nervously toward the darkness. Something else started yelling too. Ethan stared at him. You mean another person? The man's breathing quickened. I think so. Marissa listened carefully. The tunnel was silent again. No voices. No movement. just the distant sound of water dripping somewhere deep inside the mountain. Ethan stood up slowly. "Okay," he said, "let's get you out of here." But just as he reached for the radio, a sound echoed from deep inside the tunnel. Not a voice, not an echo. A movement. Slow, heavy, like someone taking a step across loose gravel. Then another. Marissa turned her flashlight toward the darkness. The beam stretched as far as it could, but the tunnel curved slightly ahead, blocking their view. For several seconds, nothing appeared. Then, another step. Closer this time. The injured man grabbed Ethan's arm suddenly. His voice was shaking. "That's the voice," he whispered. Ethan and Marissa didn't move. They just stood there, listening, because now the footsteps were getting louder, slow, uneven, dragging slightly across the ground. Whatever was walking toward them was still somewhere inside the darkness, and it was getting closer. The footsteps continued, slow, uneven, dragging slightly across the gravel-covered pavement. Ethan and Marissa stood completely still, their flashlights fixed on the dark curve of the tunnel ahead. The injured man on the ground tightened his grip on Ethan's sleeve. His voice dropped to a whisper. "That's the voice," he said. Another step echoed through the tunnel. Closer now. The sound bounced strangely off the curved walls, making it impossible to tell exactly how far away the person was. Marissa raised her voice carefully. "Hello? We're paramedics. If you can hear us, come toward the light." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a shadow shifted along the wall ahead. Someone stepped into the edge of the flashlight beam. At first, the figure looked almost unreal, just a shape moving slowly out of the darkness. Then, the light finally reached his face. A man. His clothes were dusty and torn, and he shielded his eyes from the sudden brightness as he stumbled forward. He looked exhausted, confused, like someone who hadn't slept in hours. Ethan immediately stepped toward him. "Easy," he said. "Are you hurt?" But the man didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes drifted past Ethan and landed on the injured man lying on the ground. The reaction was instant. His entire expression changed. Shock, then disbelief. "You?" he said quietly. The injured man stared back at him with the same stunned expression. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then, the man standing in the tunnel whispered something that made the entire situation suddenly make sense. "I thought you were buried." The injured man shook his head weakly. "I thought you were." Ethan and Marissa exchanged a glance. "What happened?" Marissa asked. The second man leaned against the wall, catching his breath. "We were hiking," he said, up on the ridge above the tunnel. Earlier that evening, the two friends had been exploring old service roads that hadn't been used in years. At some point, they discovered a rusted metal door hidden along the side of the tunnel wall. Behind it was an old maintenance corridor, a narrow passage built decades ago so workers could access parts of the tunnel during construction. Curious, they decided to take a look inside. But sometime later, something went wrong. Part of the old ceiling inside the corridor collapsed. Dust filled the air. The lights on their phones went dark. And in the chaos, the two men became separated. Each of them believed the other had been trapped under the rubble. The injured man had managed to crawl back toward the main tunnel before collapsing on the pavement. The second man had gone the opposite direction, searching blindly through the darkness for a way out. For hours, both of them had been yelling for help. But the curved structure of the tunnel had twisted their voices so badly that neither one could figure out where the other was. Every time they shouted, the echo came back from a different direction, until the paramedics arrived. Marissa looked back toward the distant glow of the tunnel entrance. The rectangle of moonlight looked very small from where they stood now. "You're both incredibly lucky," she said. Ethan nodded. "Yeah," he added, "because if that driver hadn't stopped when he did." Neither man finished the thought. A few minutes later, flashing red and blue lights appeared outside the tunnel. Sheriff's deputies arrived first, followed by another ambulance. Ethan and Marissa carefully lifted the injured man onto a stretcher. As they carried him toward the entrance, the cold air inside the tunnel slowly gave way to the quiet mountain night outside. The second hiker walked beside them, still shaken but alive. Later that morning, investigators searched the interior of the tunnel and the collapsed maintenance corridor. What they found surprised them. Engineers determined that the structure inside the passage had been far more unstable than anyone realized. The section that had partially collapsed earlier that night was already weakening. Within a few more hours, the entire ceiling would likely have come down completely, sealing the corridor and anyone trapped inside behind tons of concrete and rock. The county permanently sealed the entrance to that passage not long after. Officially, the incident was recorded as an accident. Two hikers exploring somewhere they shouldn't have been, a collapse that separated them, and a voice echoing through an abandoned tunnel long enough for someone passing by to hear it. But months later, Marissa would still think about that moment at the entrance of the tunnel, standing beside the barrier, listening to the darkness, hearing a human voice call out from somewhere deep inside a mountain that most people had already forgotten. Because what stayed with her the most wasn't the tunnel or the collapse. It was the realization that sometimes the difference between being found and being lost forever can be nothing more than a single driver slowing down on an empty highway and deciding to listen. A hiker found a warning carved into the canyon wall. In late autumn of 2017, a lone hiker discovered a warning carved deep into a canyon wall. By the time investigators understood what it meant, several strange details from that day had already become impossible to explain. Ronan Hale was 34 years old and worked long night shifts as a freight supervisor at a regional distribution warehouse. On most weekends, he drove away from the city, looking for quiet trails where he could hike alone and clear his mind. That Saturday morning, he headed toward a remote stretch of canyonland several hours outside the nearest town. The place was known to locals for steep walls, narrow paths, and long sections where cell signals simply disappeared. Ronan preferred trails that few people visited because crowded parks always made the experience feel rushed and noisy. According to later interviews, he packed water, a small camera, trail snacks, and a folded topographic map inside his worn hiking bag. The trail he chose that day followed a dry riverbed before bending into a deeper section of canyon. By mid-morning, the sun hung high above the cliffs, casting sharp shadows that stretched across the dusty stone floor. At first, nothing unusual happened, and Ronan walked steadily while taking photos of unusual rock formations along the path. Around noon, the canyon narrowed sharply, forcing the trail close to a tall wall of pale stone. It was there that Ronan noticed something strange, cut into the rock several feet above the ground. At first, he assumed it was graffiti left by climbers, which sometimes appeared in isolated places like this. But when he stepped closer, the markings looked older and far more deliberate than simple carved initials. The letters were deep and uneven, like someone had spent a long time pressing a sharp tool into hard stone. Ronan brushed dust away with his hand and read the words slowly, trying to understand what he was seeing. The message was short, only a single sentence carved into the canyon wall. It read, "Do not go farther. Turn back while you still can." At first, Ronan laughed quietly to himself, assuming the message was some kind of dramatic joke left by hikers. But something about the carving felt different, because the stone around the letters looked weathered and very old. The grooves held darker sediment that had settled over many seasons of rain and wind. It suggested the warning had been there much longer than the average trail marker or tourist graffiti. Ronan took several photos of the carving with his small camera before stepping back to examine the surrounding rock. There were no signatures, no dates, and no other markings nearby that explained who might have written the message. The trail continued deeper into the canyon, only a few yards past the carved warning. From where Ronan stood, the path curved slightly and disappeared behind a sharp bend in the stone walls. He checked his watch and considered turning around, mostly because the warning had unsettled him more than he expected. Still, curiosity pushed him forward, and the idea of a mysterious carving made the hike suddenly more interesting. Before continuing, Ronan scanned the ground carefully for footprints or signs of recent visitors passing through the narrow corridor. The dust looked mostly undisturbed, except for faint animal tracks weaving between scattered rocks along the canyon floor. No fresh boot prints appeared anywhere near the carved warning. That detail would later become one of the first things investigators wrote down in their notes. Ronan hesitated for another moment before lifting his camera again and recording a short video of the strange message. In the footage, his voice sounded calm, though later listeners noticed a hint of uncertainty in his tone. He quietly read the carved sentence aloud and joked that someone out there probably had a strange sense of humor. Then he turned the camera toward the trail ahead and began walking deeper into the canyon. For the next several minutes, the path remained silent, except for the steady sound of Ronan's boots against loose gravel. The canyon walls grew taller as he continued, blocking more sunlight and lowering the temperature noticeably. According to the timestamp on his camera footage, about 12 minutes passed after he left the carved warning behind. That was when Ronan stopped walking again and aimed the camera towards something farther ahead along the trail. At first, the video captured only stone and shadow, but then a shape slowly appeared near the base of the canyon wall. It looked like another carving, larger this time, etched into a darker section of rock several yards ahead. Ronan moved closer to read it clearly, unaware that the second message would soon make the first warning seem far less mysterious. Ronan Hale approached the darker section of stone with slow steps, holding the camera steady as he moved closer. The second carving was much larger than the first message he had discovered earlier along the narrow canyon trail. Unlike the first warning, this carving stretched across several feet of rock and looked hurried, almost desperate in appearance. The letters were uneven and deeper in some places, suggesting whoever carved them had worked quickly under pressure. Ronan stepped closer and wiped loose sand from the grooves with the side of his hand. The words slowly became clear as the dust fell away from the surface of the rock. The message read, "If you see this, someone ignored the first warning." For several seconds, Ronan said nothing, while the camera quietly recorded the carved sentence in sharp afternoon light. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded quieter than before, and the casual tone from earlier had disappeared. He muttered that the place suddenly felt less like a hiking trail and more like the beginning of a strange story. Still, he continued walking slowly toward the bend in the canyon where the path narrowed even further. Investigators would later review the camera footage many times while studying the sequence of events from that afternoon. At first, nothing unusual appeared beyond the two carved warnings and Ronan's calm but cautious reactions. But a few minutes after passing the second carving, something else entered the frame briefly near the canyon floor. The camera caught a glimpse of what looked like a rusted metal object, partly buried under layers of dust. Ronan noticed it immediately and crouched down to brush away loose gravel from the small exposed corner. As he cleared more dirt, the shape slowly revealed itself as a narrow metal box. The box looked old and heavily weathered, with one side bent inward as if something heavy had struck it years earlier. Ronan turned the camera toward it while carefully lifting the lid, which opened with a dry scraping sound. Inside the box were several folded papers wrapped in a thin plastic sleeve that had yellowed with age. There was also a small flashlight and what appeared to be an old cassette tape. Ronan pulled the papers out first and unfolded them while kneeling in the dust beside the canyon wall. The camera footage shook slightly as he adjusted his position to read the faded writing. The pages contained handwritten notes filled with rough sketches of the canyon and short lines of hurried instructions. One sentence appeared several times across the pages, written in thicker ink than the rest. It said, "Stay out of the narrow passage after the second bend." Ronan glanced up toward the trail ahead, where the canyon curved sharply out of view about 30 yards away. That bend matched the rough drawing on the paper almost perfectly. Another page described strange sounds echoing through the canyon at night, though the details were incomplete and difficult to read. The final page contained a short message that seemed written in a rush. It read, "If we do not come back, warn anyone who finds this." For a moment, Ronan simply stared at the paper while the wind pushed loose sand along the canyon floor. The quiet surroundings suddenly felt heavier, as if the walls around him were closing in slowly. He folded the papers again and placed them back inside the plastic sleeve before returning them to the metal box. Then he stood up and looked once more toward the bend, farther down the trail. The sunlight barely reached that section of canyon now, leaving the path ahead covered in long shadows. From where he stood, the narrow passage looked darker than the rest of the trail behind him. Ronan hesitated while considering whether the warnings were part of an elaborate prank or something more serious. Eventually, curiosity won again, and he decided to walk a little farther just to see what lay beyond the bend. He lifted the camera and continued down the path while recording everything around him in steady silence. The canyon grew noticeably tighter as he approached the place marked on the old map inside the metal box. Then, just before reaching the bend, Ronan stopped suddenly. Something else had been carved into the stone at eye level along the right side of the canyon wall. But this carving looked very different from the earlier warnings. Instead of words, the stone showed several deep vertical marks lined closely beside each other. Each mark was nearly a foot long and cut much deeper than any of the messages Ronan had already seen. The camera moved closer as Ronan leaned toward the strange markings for a better look. That was when a faint sound echoed somewhere beyond the bend ahead. At first, it was so quiet the camera microphone barely captured it. But Ronan heard it clearly enough to freeze where he stood. It sounded like a single rock sliding slowly across stone somewhere deeper inside the canyon. Ronan Hale remained completely still after hearing the faint sound echo through the narrow canyon corridor. For several seconds, the camera recorded nothing but the quiet wind moving dust across the rocky ground. He slowly turned his head toward the bend ahead, listening carefully for any sign that something else was moving nearby. The canyon remained silent, though the long walls around him carried even the smallest sound surprisingly far. Ronan whispered that it was probably a small animal knocking loose stones somewhere deeper along the trail. Still, his voice sounded less certain than it had earlier during the hike. He took a few cautious steps toward the bend while holding the camera steady in front of him. The strange vertical markings in the rock remained visible behind him as the path curved out of sight. Those marks would later become one of the most discussed details once investigators reviewed the footage. Each line looked sharp and deliberate, though no tool marks could be clearly identified in the video. When Ronan reached the bend, he paused again and slowly angled the camera around the corner first. The narrow passage opened into a slightly wider section of canyon covered with scattered stones and fallen debris. Nothing moved inside the open space at first glance. The ground looked uneven and sloped gently downward toward another darker corridor farther ahead. Ronan stepped forward carefully and continued recording as he walked into the wider clearing between the canyon walls. A few seconds later, the camera tilted suddenly toward the ground. Part of a human boot appeared in the dust several feet away near the base of the opposite wall. The rest of the shape slowly came into view as Ronan approached. Half buried beneath loose gravel was the skeletal outline of a hiking pack and what remained of a person beside it. The bones were scattered slightly, as if they had been exposed to years of harsh weather. Ronan stopped immediately and lowered the camera while staring at the discovery in stunned silence. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded quiet and shaken. He said someone must have gotten lost here a long time ago and never found their way back out. Then, he carefully stepped closer to examine the abandoned gear lying beside the remains. The backpack looked extremely old, with faded straps and cracked plastic buckles coated in thick canyon dust. Ronan noticed a small metal tag attached to one of the zippers. He brushed it clean with his thumb and read the faint lettering engraved across its surface. The tag carried a name and a year that had nearly worn away. The camera struggled to focus, but investigators later enhanced the frame during their analysis of the footage. The tag appeared to read a name, followed by the year 1998. That discovery matched the age of the rusted metal box Ronan had found earlier along the trail. It also matched the style of handwriting on the warning notes stored inside the plastic sleeve. For a moment, Ronan looked back toward the direction he had come from earlier that afternoon. The narrow bend now seemed much farther away than it had only minutes before. Then, another sound echoed faintly through the canyon behind him. This time, the noise was clearer than before and lasted slightly longer. It sounded like several small stones sliding down rock somewhere along the path Ronan had already walked. The camera shifted as he turned quickly toward the sound. The trail behind him remained empty. But dust drifted slowly in the air near the bend as if something had just moved through the passage. Ronan stared in that direction for several long seconds without speaking. Finally, he backed away from the skeletal remains and began walking toward the bend again. His footsteps grew faster as he returned along the narrow trail that led back toward the carved warnings. The camera footage shook more with each step as he moved through the tight canyon corridor. When Ronan reached the second carved message, he paused only briefly before continuing toward the first warning. The sunlight near the entrance of the canyon now appeared brighter than before. The last clear video clip ended as Ronan approached the original carved sentence in the canyon wall. The camera pointed directly at the words, telling hikers to turn back while they still could. The recording stopped abruptly a few seconds later. No further footage was found on the camera. Ronan Hale returned home later that evening and reported the discovery to local authorities the next morning. Search teams later recovered the remains inside the canyon and confirmed the person had died many years earlier. Investigators concluded the warnings were likely carved by members of an earlier hiking group searching for their missing friend. The metal box and written notes appeared to have been left as a final attempt to warn others. But one detail from Ronan's footage was never fully explained by those investigators. The drifting dust near the canyon bend suggested something had moved there moments before he looked back. Ronan himself later admitted he never returned to that trail again. He said the warnings had done exactly what they were meant to do. They made sure the next person who found them chose to leave. One line in the dispatch log changed the case. The case would later be defined by a single sentence typed during a quiet overnight shift. At the time, it looked like nothing more than routine documentation from a call that felt ordinary. The call came in just after 12:30 in the morning, when the county usually went silent. MrBallen Crane had been a dispatcher for nearly 13 years, and she trusted patterns more than instincts. Most serious emergencies announce themselves clearly, with panic, noise, and urgency spilling through the line. This call did not. The man who called sounded winded but controlled, like someone trying to sound calm on purpose. He said he was driving home when his headlights caught a pickup truck down in a roadside ditch. The vehicle sat nose forward at an odd angle, with no lights on and no movement inside. MrBallen asked for his location, and he hesitated before answering. He gave a mile marker, then corrected himself, then mentioned a service road nearby. She typed carefully, noting the changes without commenting on them. He said he walked up to the truck and looked through the driver's window. There was blood on the steering wheel, dark and dried in places. The driver was slumped forward, seatbelt on, and not responding. MrBallen asked if he had checked for breathing. The man said no, he did not want to touch anything. His voice tightened slightly when he said it, then smoothed out again. She dispatched a patrol unit and volunteer medics, classifying the call as a single vehicle accident. As she worked through the checklist, she kept listening to the background noise on the line. There was wind, distant traffic, and nothing else. Just before hanging up, the man added something she had not asked about. He said the crash must have happened hours earlier because nobody else was around. MrBallen paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She asked him why he thought the crash was old. The man hesitated, then said the truck just looked like it had been there a while. That answer felt thin, but not thin enough to challenge. MrBallen asked one more question, keeping her tone neutral. She asked if the engine felt cold. The man said no, the engine was warm. There was a brief silence after that, the kind that lingered longer than expected. MrBallen typed as he spoke, documenting the contradiction without comment. Caller reports engine warm despite belief crash occurred hours earlier. She closed the call and moved on, already answering another line. In her experience, small inconsistencies were common and usually meaningless. 11 minutes later, Deputy Alric Boone arrived at the scene. He was nearing the end of a long shift and hoped for a quick resolution. What he saw matched the report closely enough to satisfy him. The driver was identified as Roland Ives, age 46, a local mechanic. He was slumped forward in the seat with a visible head wound near his hairline. There were no skid marks, no broken signs, and no debris scattered across the road. The medic confirmed death at the scene, estimating it had occurred sometime earlier. With no obvious signs of foul play, the incident was logged as non-suspicious. The truck was towed, photos were taken, and traffic flowed again. By sunrise, the case was already settling into paperwork. It looked like another lonely death on a forgotten stretch of road. No witnesses, no clear cause, and no reason to look twice. MrBallen returned for her next shift that night and barely remembered the call. The dispatch log remained unchanged, one line sitting quietly among dozens of others. 2 days later, that line would be read again, and nothing would be routine after that. 2 days after the crash, the file reached an investigator who did not trust summaries. Halden Pierce was 51, methodical, and known for rereading what others skimmed once. He believed most mistakes lived in margins, timestamps, and sentences people assumed were harmless. He read the report front to back, then opened the dispatch log. That was where he stopped. The line about the warm engine did not fit the timeline at all. If the crash happened hours earlier, the engine should have been cold. If the engine was warm, then the crash was recent or the truck was run afterward. Either option meant the initial conclusion was wrong. Halden requested the tow yard intake notes before doing anything else. The operator had written that the hood felt warm when he hooked the truck. He also noted the radio was playing a local station that signed off overnight. That detail mattered. The station stopped broadcasting just after midnight. If the radio was still on, the truck had been running not long before discovery. Halden pulled traffic camera footage from the nearest working intersection. It was miles away, grainy, and rarely useful, but he checked anyway. He found a pickup matching the truck passing through 20 minutes before the call. That erased the idea of a crash sitting unnoticed for hours. Someone had either been mistaken or someone had lied. Halden reclassified the case and requested the original caller information. The name was Keaton Rule, age 32, a local delivery driver. His record included minor theft and a previous false report years earlier. Halden brought Keaton in for a follow-up interview. Keaton appeared cooperative, but his answers drifted under pressure. He repeated the story, then adjusted small details without noticing. He said he was driving home, then later said he was heading out. He said the truck looked abandoned, then said he could see fresh blood. When asked about the engine, he avoided eye contact. Halden asked him directly why he believed the crash was old. Keaton said it was just a feeling, nothing specific. That answer did not survive silence. Phone records placed Keaton near the area earlier that night. They also showed his emergency call came from several miles away. That explained why nobody saw him at the scene. While Halden waited on more records, the autopsy report arrived. The medical examiner noted blunt force trauma inconsistent with a steering wheel impact. The wound suggested a heavy object, delivered with force from close range. Halden visited Roland Ives's garage the same afternoon. The place was orderly, with tools aligned and labeled. One space on the wall was empty, the outline of a tire iron visible in dust. Oil stains on the floor showed a recent vehicle movement. The pattern suggested the truck had been driven after an abrupt stop. It looked less like an accident and more like cleanup. Halden brought Keaton back in for a second interview. This time, the tone changed. Halden laid out the timeline slowly, one piece at a time. The warm engine, the radio station, the camera footage, the missing tool. Keaton listened, nodding, breathing shallow, saying nothing. When Halden finished, he slid the dispatch log across the table. He pointed to the single line typed by a dispatcher he had never met. Halden asked Keaton if the engine was warm because he had just shut it off. Keaton swallowed hard and stared at the table. He did not answer. The room stayed quiet longer than most people could tolerate. When Keaton finally looked up, his face had changed, and Halden knew the case was about to break open. Keaton broke the silence by asking for water, then pushed the cup away without drinking. His shoulders slumped, as if he had been holding himself upright by force alone. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower and steadier than Halden expected. He said he knew Roland and that they had known each other for years. They had worked together briefly at a repair shop before money ruined the friendship. Roland had accused him of stealing tools, and the argument never fully died. On the night of the crash, Keaton went to Roland's garage to confront him. He claimed he only wanted to talk, but the discussion turned heated quickly. Words turned into shouting, and shouting turned into something neither planned. Keaton said Roland grabbed a tire iron from the wall, not to swing it, but to threaten him. Keaton reacted without thinking, striking first and harder than he realized. Roland fell backward, hit his head, and did not get back up. Keaton said he panicked when he realized Roland was not moving. He checked for breathing, found none, and felt the weight of what he had done. Instead of calling for help, he made a decision he thought would save him. He dragged Roland into the truck, buckled him in, and wiped down the garage floor. He drove the truck out to the highway, choosing a spot he thought looked accidental. He eased it into the ditch, careful not to leave skid marks. He left the engine running longer than intended, then shut it off and walked away. After driving several miles, he called emergency services and pretended to discover the crash. He believed distance would erase connection and time would erase doubt. What he did not consider was habit. He did not consider a dispatcher trained to document contradictions without judgment. He did not consider how machines recorded things people forgot. The confession aligned cleanly with the evidence already gathered. Phone records, camera footage, tool placement, and injury patterns matched his account. The case moved quickly once the story stopped changing. Keaton was charged with manslaughter and evidence tampering. He accepted a plea agreement months later, avoiding trial and a longer sentence. The final paperwork was sealed, and the case faded from public attention. Maribel Crane learned about the outcome through an internal bulletin. Her name was not mentioned, and her note was not highlighted. To her, it was just another closed call from years earlier. She continued working nights, answering phones, and typing details others overlooked. She never asked what happened to the cases that passed through her hands. She only believed that accuracy mattered even when nobody seemed to notice. Halden Pierce retired several years later. When asked about cases that stayed with him, he mentioned this one quietly. He said the truth often hides inside sentences people rush past. The crash was never what it appeared to be. It was not solved by a dramatic discovery or a single bold move. It was solved because one line did not match the story it belonged to. Long after the files were archived, that line remained unchanged. A simple observation typed during a quiet shift. One line in the dispatch log that changed the case. The night guard who found a camera still recording. The camera had been recording for nearly 7 hours when the night guard finally noticed the small red light. By the time anyone reviewed the footage, investigators would say the recording explained almost everything that happened that night. Calder Vance was 38 years old and worked the overnight security shift at a quiet industrial storage complex outside town. The job mostly involved slow patrols through empty corridors, while forklifts and shipping crates slept under dim warehouse lighting. Calder preferred the silence because it made the hours pass easily without supervisors asking questions or coworkers starting pointless conversations. The storage complex belonged to a logistics company that handled overflow inventory from several regional retailers during busy shipping seasons. Most units held sealed pallets of furniture or boxed electronics waiting for transport trucks scheduled during the early morning hours. On that particular Thursday night, the facility felt unusually still, even compared with the normal quiet Calder experienced every shift. The weather outside had turned cold and dry, which caused the metal siding along the warehouses to creak softly. Calder completed his first patrol just after 1 in the morning and returned to the security office near the loading docks. Inside the office, he watched the row of surveillance monitors that displayed every hallway, gate entrance, and warehouse aisle. Nothing moved on any screen except the occasional flicker of fluorescent lights reflecting off polished concrete floors. About 20 minutes later, Calder noticed something strange on one of the interior camera feeds from Warehouse 4. The image showed a small portable camera resting on top of a wooden crate near the center aisle. At first, Calder assumed a worker from the previous shift had accidentally left personal equipment behind during evening inventory checks. The strange part was the blinking red recording light that flashed steadily toward the ceiling above the crate. Calder leaned closer to the monitor because portable cameras were not allowed anywhere inside the storage complex. Company policy prohibited photography due to confidential inventory contracts with several private retail partners across the region. Calder rewound the feed a few minutes through the digital recording system, expecting to see someone placing the device. Instead, the footage showed the camera sitting on the crate exactly the same way for hours. The system log confirmed the camera first appeared shortly before 7 that evening during the final hour of daytime operations. No employee report mentioned filming or photography inside Warehouse 4 during the shift change earlier that night. Calder grabbed a flashlight and radio before leaving the office to investigate the strange object himself. The walk across the dark loading dock felt longer than usual as cold air drifted through the large delivery doors. When Calder reached the metal entrance to Warehouse 4, he noticed the door was already unlocked. That detail alone was unusual because the night protocol required every interior warehouse door to remain locked after 10. Calder pushed the door open slowly and stepped into the wide storage space filled with stacked crates and silent forklifts. The only light came from overhead fixtures that cast long shadows between aisles of wrapped pallets. About 30 yards ahead, Calder could see the small camera sitting exactly where the monitor showed. Its red recording light blinked steadily in the quiet warehouse as if waiting for someone to finally notice it. Calder approached cautiously because something about the scene felt staged rather than accidental. He lifted the camera carefully from the crate and noticed the lens pointed directly toward the warehouse entrance behind him. Calder frowned and spoke quietly into his radio, asking if anyone from management authorized recording equipment inside the building. The dispatcher answered after a moment and said no filming permits had been issued for the property that night. Calder turned the camera around in his hands and realized the recording timer was still running. 7 hours and 16 minutes appeared on the small digital display beneath the blinking light. That meant the device started filming long before Calder arrived for his overnight shift. He considered shutting the camera off, but curiosity stopped him for a moment longer. Calder pressed the playback button to review the beginning of the footage while standing beside the crate. The screen flickered once before showing the same warehouse aisle earlier that evening. For several minutes, nothing happened in the recording except workers finishing their final tasks before leaving the building. Then, the camera view suddenly shifted as someone stepped into frame and placed the device on the crate. The person wore a dark hooded jacket that hid most facial details from the camera lens. However, one important detail became clear immediately when the figure looked directly into the recording. The person knew exactly where Calder would eventually stand. Calder stood beside the crate and watched the footage again, holding the small camera close to his face. The hooded figure remained in the frame for several seconds after placing the device carefully on the wooden surface. The person adjusted the camera angle slowly until the warehouse entrance filled the center of the screen. For a moment, the figure looked straight into the lens, as if checking whether the framing was correct. Then the person raised one hand and pointed directly toward the doorway where Calder now stood. The gesture felt deliberate and unsettling because the camera had been aimed exactly at that position. Calder felt a slow, chill run across his shoulders while the recording continued to play quietly in his hands. The hooded figure finally stepped backward and walked down the main aisle between tall stacks of sealed crates. Within seconds, the person disappeared into the darker section near the rear loading doors. For several hours, nothing happened on the recording except silent warehouse lights flickering above empty concrete floors. Calder tapped the fast-forward button until movement appeared again near the far end of the building. The timestamp now showed 11:43 in the evening, according to the digital display on screen. A rear loading door opened slowly, and a man stepped inside carrying a dark duffel bag over one shoulder. The man moved carefully along the aisle while glancing behind him several times. Calder leaned closer to the screen when the stranger finally crossed in front of the camera lens. Under the overhead lighting, his face became visible for a brief but clear moment. Calder immediately recognized the man as Darian Salt, a part-time forklift operator from the afternoon crew. Darian normally finished work around 6 in the evening and never stayed inside the complex after shift hours. The recording showed Darian placing the duffel bag on the floor beside the crate holding the camera. He began opening several sealed cartons stacked nearby, each one filled with newly delivered electronic tablets. Darian worked quickly while pulling the expensive devices from the boxes and sliding them into the duffel bag. Every few seconds, he paused and looked toward the warehouse entrance as if listening for approaching footsteps. The camera captured everything clearly from its position on top of the crate. Within 10 minutes, the duffel bag was already half full with stolen tablets removed from several cartons. Darian resealed the boxes carefully and pushed them back into place among the surrounding pallets. The recording continued as he lifted the heavy bag and prepared to leave the warehouse the same way he entered. Just before walking away, Darian noticed something that stopped him suddenly in the center aisle. His eyes moved slowly toward the small camera, resting only a few feet away. For the first time, he seemed to notice the blinking red recording light. Darian stepped closer and leaned down toward the lens with a confused expression on his face. Calder watched the screen closely as Darian studied the device in silence for several seconds. The man looked around the empty warehouse once more before focusing on the camera again. Then he leaned closer to the microphone and whispered something quietly that the recording barely captured. Calder raised the small camera closer to his ear and replayed the final seconds of the recording several times. The warehouse around him remained silent, except for the faint sound coming from the camera speaker. Darian's face filled the screen while he leaned closer to the lens with a tense expression. For several seconds, he studied the device as if trying to understand why it was there. Then he looked directly into the lens and whispered a short sentence toward the microphone. The audio sounded weak and distorted, but the words slowly became clear after Calder replayed the clip again. Darian said, "Someone already knows you will watch this." After speaking those words, he lifted the duffel bag from the floor and stepped away from the crate. The recording showed him walking quickly down the aisle toward the rear loading doors. Within seconds, he disappeared through the doorway and the warehouse became empty again. The camera continued recording for several more hours without capturing any additional movement. Calder stood quietly beside the crate while the red recording light blinked in the dim warehouse lighting. Something about the message made him uneasy because Darian sounded genuinely frightened rather than confident. Calder returned to the security office and reported the entire situation through the company dispatch line. Management contacted local investigators before the morning shift arrived at the facility later that day. Detectives collected the camera along with the security recordings from the building surveillance system. Those recordings confirmed that Darian Salt entered the warehouse shortly before midnight through the rear loading doors. They also confirmed that he never passed through the front security gate after leaving the building. Police searched Darian's apartment 3 days later and recovered most of the stolen electronic tablets. However, Darian himself was not there, and investigators could not determine where he went after that night. The small portable camera remained the most unusual piece of evidence recovered from the warehouse. No fingerprints were found on the device except Calder and Darian from when they handled it. Security footage from earlier that evening showed nothing, clearly identifying the hooded figure who placed the camera. Investigators believed the person entered the building during the busy final hour of daytime operations. That was the only time the facility allowed outside delivery drivers and temporary contractors inside the warehouse. Even after reviewing every available recording, no one could identify the individual who set the camera on the crate. What puzzled detectives most was the way the device had been positioned toward the entrance. It was placed exactly where Calder would stand hours later while reviewing the strange recording. The message Darian whispered into the lens also raised questions that investigators never fully answered. "Someone already knows you will watch this." Calder often remembered those words during later night shifts when the warehouses felt unusually quiet. The red recording light had blinked patiently for hours as if waiting for the right moment. And when Calder finally found the camera still recording, it already knew exactly who would watch the footage. A motel room that never showed up on records. A motel room became the source of quiet confusion years after a single overnight shift revealed a problem nobody could later document. For one night, the room functioned normally, then slowly disappeared from official existence. Calvin Rohn was 39 years old and worked the overnight desk at a roadside motel along a secondary highway. The building dated back to the late 1970s and mostly served truck drivers and travelers arriving after midnight. Calvin preferred night shifts because routines stayed predictable, and predictable routines made irregularities easier to notice. On a cold winter night in 2011, Calvin began his shift just before midnight and reviewed the occupancy board behind the front desk. Only 6 rooms were occupied, leaving the ground floor mostly empty and unusually quiet. Outside, passing traffic was light and the parking lot sat still under yellow security lights. At around 1:30 in the morning, a man entered the lobby wearing a dark jacket and carrying a small duffel bag. He looked tired but alert and asked for a quiet room away from traffic noise. He added that he planned to leave early and did not need a wake-up call. Calvin processed the payment in cash and slid a registration card across the counter. He chose room 17 at the far end of the ground floor, a room rarely requested because of its distance from the lobby. The guest signed, took the key envelope, thanked Calvin briefly, and walked toward the exterior corridor without hesitation. Calvin marked room 17 as occupied in his handwritten backup ledger. He kept the ledger in case the aging computer system froze during overnight audits. He watched the guest disappear around the corner through the lobby window, then returned to his routine checks and paperwork. The next 90 minutes passed quietly. No new guests arrived, and the lobby stayed silent except for the hum of the vending machine. Calvin completed his audit entries and checked the security monitor, which showed empty walkways and motionless parked vehicles. Just after 3 in the morning, the desk phone rang. The display showed an internal extension rather than an outside line. Calvin answered and heard a calm male voice asking for extra towels. The caller said he was staying in room 17 and mentioned that the heater rattled loudly whenever it turned on. Calvin apologized and said he would bring towels after finishing a short report entry. The caller thanked him and hung up without further comment. Calvin wrote a brief note about the heater complaint on a maintenance slip. Heater issues were common in winter, especially in older rooms near the utility areas. Nothing about the call seemed unusual, yet the room number stayed clear in his mind. He gathered 2 towels from the supply cabinet and stepped outside into the cold hallway. The overhead lights hummed softly as he walked toward the far end of the building. His footsteps echoed slightly, and the hallway felt longer than usual during the quiet hour. When he reached the last door, the light above it flickered once before steadying. Calvin knocked and announced himself. No one answered, but he heard movement inside, like footsteps crossing the floor, then stopping. Calvin waited a moment, listening for a response or the heater noise mentioned earlier. Hearing nothing, he placed the towels neatly on the small table near the door. He turned and walked back toward the lobby, assuming the guest would collect them shortly. He did not receive any further calls from room 17 for the rest of the night. The quiet returned, and Calvin finished his shift, believing the situation was ordinary. At the time, nothing suggested that room 17 would later refuse to exist on paper. The night ended without incident, yet the details of that shift stayed clear in Calvin's memory. The cash payment, the phone call, and the movement behind the door formed a routine pattern. It was only later that the routine would begin to unravel. Morning came quietly, and Calvin began preparing checkout paperwork as pale light crept through the lobby windows. He noticed room 17 still marked as occupied in the ledger and hesitated before continuing his routine. Around 6, Calvin walked the ground floor hallway to check for early departures before housekeeping arrived. When he reached the far end, the door to the room remained closed, and the key was still in the lock. He knocked twice and announced himself, but no sound came from inside. Calvin waited several seconds, listening for movement or the heater noise mentioned during the call. The hallway stayed silent, and the air near that door felt cooler than elsewhere. He returned to the desk and noted the lack of response, assuming the guest left early. Housekeeping arrived shortly after 7 and began their usual rounds. Within minutes, one attendant returned to the lobby and said the last room on the ground floor was already empty. Calvin asked for clarification, and the attendant said there were no personal items anywhere. The bed appeared untouched, the bathroom dry, and the trash bin empty. The towels Calvin delivered earlier were folded neatly on the small table near the door. The heater was cold, and nothing suggested a guest had stayed there overnight. Calvin felt a brief wave of unease, but dismissed it as an unusual checkout. Some guests stayed only a few hours, especially those driving long distances overnight. He handed the key to housekeeping and continued closing out his shift paperwork. Later that morning, the manager reviewed the cash drawer and noticed a discrepancy. The payment Calvin remembered accepting for room 17 did not appear in the tally. Calvin opened his ledger and pointed to the entry, which was written clearly in his handwriting. They checked the computer system together, and no rental record appeared for that room during the night. The manager suggested the payment might have been logged under another room number or returned by mistake. With no receipt and no guest, the books were adjusted and balanced. Calvin mentioned the phone call and the heater complaint, but without a system record, it sounded like memory alone. The manager suggested fatigue might have caused confusion and advised Calvin to get rest before his next shift. The issue was closed as a clerical error. Calvin left the motel that morning feeling unsettled, but unsure how to press the matter further. Nothing concrete supported his recollection beyond the ledger entry and his memory of the call. Over time, the night faded into the background of many uneventful shifts. Years passed, and the motel continued operating with small changes in staff and procedures. Calvin stayed on the overnight desk and noticed that the far-end room was never assigned again. Housekeeping no longer referenced it, and maintenance stopped logging issues there. In 2019, the property prepared for sale and underwent a full audit of records and facilities. External auditors reviewed blueprints, occupancy logs, and maintenance files going back decades. Calvin assisted when asked, answering questions about overnight procedures. During one review session, an auditor asked about the numbering of ground floor rooms. The official list showed rooms 1 through 16, with no room 17 included. Calvin said there had always been a room 17 at the far end of the hallway. The auditor showed him original construction blueprints, which labeled that space as a utility access and sealed storage area. Calvin insisted he had checked guests into that room during his early years at the motel. The auditor noted the statement and requested further verification. Maintenance records confirmed the door existed but categorized it as non-guest access. The lock matched guest room hardware, though its serial number did not appear in the official registry. There were no housekeeping logs, maintenance tickets, or occupancy records tied to the space. Calvin walked the auditor down the hallway and pointed to the door. The number plate was gone, but a faint outline of adhesive remained on the surface. The wall paint around the door looked newer, as if it had been updated separately from the rest. Archived phone logs were reviewed next. They showed an internal call at 3:12 in the morning on the exact date Calvin remembered. The call originated from an extension associated with the utility area behind that wall. A retired maintenance supervisor was later contacted and said the space had been temporarily converted during a renovation in the early 2000s. He said it was used briefly during peak seasons and later reverted to storage without full documentation. He could not explain the missing payment. Calvin retrieved his old ledger from storage at home. The page from that night still showed room 17 written clearly. No other pages referenced that room before or after. The auditors photographed the entry and added it to the final report. The conclusion stated that the room existed temporarily but was never formally integrated into the system. The guest likely stayed briefly and left early, and the payment discrepancy remained unresolved. After the sale, the new owners sealed the door permanently. Calvin eventually left the motel and took a job closer to home. Sometimes he passed the building and remembered the night he checked someone into a room that later vanished from records. He never claimed anything beyond what he observed. To him, the story stayed grounded in forgotten paperwork and overlooked renovations. Still, the memory of a phone call from a room that officially never existed stayed with him. It reminded him that some places function briefly as real, even when history later refuses to record them. The audit ended quietly, and the sale moved forward without delay once the final report was submitted. Calvin was not contacted again about room 17, and no one asked him to clarify his statements further. The issue settled into paperwork, where unresolved details often stayed without consequence. Several weeks after the new owners took control, Calvin noticed changes during his overnight shifts. Maintenance crews worked late evenings, repainting hallways and replacing fixtures that showed their age. One night, he walked past the far end of the ground floor and saw workers removing the door entirely. The opening behind it revealed a shallow space with exposed piping and wiring that matched utility access descriptions from the blueprints. The wall inside looked unfinished compared to the rest of the motel rooms. By morning, the opening was sealed with drywall and painted to match the corridor. The hallway felt shorter after that, and the far wall looked plain and uninterrupted. Guests never walked that far anymore, and no one asked about a missing room. New staff members learned the layout from updated diagrams that ended at room 16. Calvin stayed on for several months after the sale, training replacement staff and helping transition overnight procedures. None of them knew about room 17, and Calvin did not volunteer the story unless directly asked. He sensed that without records, the details sounded like a mistake rather than a memory. Before leaving the job, Calvin reviewed his old ledger one final time. The entry for that winter night remained unchanged, with room 17 written clearly between other routine notes. It stood alone as the only reference to a room that no longer existed anywhere else. He placed the ledger back in storage and accepted that no further answers would come. The auditors had offered the most plausible explanation, even if parts of it felt incomplete. The space had been used, then erased through neglect rather than intent. Years later, Calvin drove past the motel while traveling for work and barely recognized it. New signage covered the entrance, and fresh paint masked the building's age. Nothing on the exterior suggested that an extra room once operated quietly at the far end. He did not think of the experience as mysterious in a dramatic sense. To him, it reflected how systems fail when temporary decisions go undocumented. A room could exist, serve its purpose, and disappear without leaving more than a trace in one person's memory. The phone call stayed with him most clearly. Someone had used that extension, described a heater problem, and thanked him for help. That moment felt real, regardless of what blueprints or databases later claimed. Calvin understood that places changed and records followed rules that reality did not always respect. What mattered was that the interaction happened, even if no official system agreed. The room had been real for one night, then surrendered to correction and paint. In the end, Calvin accepted that some details are lost not through secrecy, but through indifference. The motel moved on. The hallway stayed quiet, and room 17 remained absent from every list. Only one person remembered walking towels down a corridor that no longer led anywhere. A motel room that never showed up on records. A motel room became the source of quiet confusion years after a single overnight shift revealed a problem nobody could later document. For one night, the room functioned normally, then slowly disappeared from official existence. Calvin Rohn was 39 years old and worked the overnight desk at a roadside motel along a secondary highway. The building dated back to the late 1970s and mostly served truck drivers and travelers arriving after midnight. Calvin preferred night shifts because routines stayed predictable, and predictable routines made irregularities easier to notice. On a cold winter night in 2011, Calvin began his shift just before midnight and reviewed the occupancy board behind the front desk. Only 6 rooms were occupied, leaving the ground floor mostly empty and unusually quiet. Outside, passing traffic was light and the parking lot sat still under yellow security lights. At around 1:30 in the morning, a man entered the lobby wearing a dark jacket and carrying a small duffel bag. He looked tired but alert and asked for a quiet room away from traffic noise. He added that he planned to leave early and did not need a wake-up call. Calvin processed the payment in cash and slid a registration card across the counter. He chose room 17 at the far end of the ground floor, a room rarely requested because of its distance from the lobby. The guest signed, took the key envelope, thanked Calvin briefly, and walked toward the exterior corridor without hesitation. Calvin marked room 17 as occupied in his handwritten backup ledger. He kept the ledger in case the aging computer system froze during overnight audits. He watched the guest disappear around the corner through the lobby window, then returned to his routine checks and paperwork. The next 90 minutes passed quietly. No new guests arrived, and the lobby stayed silent except for the hum of the vending machine. Calvin completed his audit entries and checked the security monitor, which showed empty walkways and motionless parked vehicles. Just after 3 in the morning, the desk phone rang. The display showed an internal extension rather than an outside line. Calvin answered and heard a calm male voice asking for extra towels. The caller said he was staying in room 17 and mentioned that the heater rattled loudly whenever it turned on. Calvin apologized and said he would bring towels after finishing a short report entry. The caller thanked him and hung up without further comment. Calvin wrote a brief note about the heater complaint on a maintenance slip. Heater issues were common in winter, especially in older rooms near the utility areas. Nothing about the call seemed unusual, yet the room number stayed clear in his mind. He gathered 2 towels from the supply cabinet and stepped outside into the cold hallway. The overhead lights hummed softly as he walked toward the far end of the building. His footsteps echoed slightly, and the hallway felt longer than usual during the quiet hour. When he reached the last door, the light above it flickered once before steadying. Calvin knocked and announced himself. No one answered, but he heard movement inside, like footsteps crossing the floor, then stopping. Calvin waited a moment, listening for a response or the heater noise mentioned earlier. Hearing nothing, he placed the towels neatly on the small table near the door. He turned and walked back toward the lobby, assuming the guest would collect them shortly. He did not receive any further calls from room 17 for the rest of the night. The quiet returned, and Calvin finished his shift, believing the situation was ordinary. At the time, nothing suggested that room 17 would later refuse to exist on paper. The night ended without incident, yet the details of that shift stayed clear in Calvin's memory. The cash payment, the phone call, and the movement behind the door formed a routine pattern. It was only later that the routine would begin to unravel. Morning came quietly, and Calvin began preparing checkout paperwork as pale light crept through the lobby windows. He noticed room 17 still marked as occupied in the ledger and hesitated before continuing his routine. Around 6, Calvin walked the ground floor hallway to check for early departures before housekeeping arrived. When he reached the far end, the door to the room remained closed, and the key was still in the lock. He knocked twice and announced himself, but no sound came from inside. Calvin waited several seconds, listening for movement or the heater noise mentioned during the call. The hallway stayed silent, and the air near that door felt cooler than elsewhere. He returned to the desk and noted the lack of response, assuming the guest left early. Housekeeping arrived shortly after 7 and began their usual rounds. Within minutes, one attendant returned to the lobby and said the last room on the ground floor was already empty. Calvin asked for clarification, and the attendant said there were no personal items anywhere. The bed appeared untouched, the bathroom dry, and the trash bin empty. The towels Calvin delivered earlier were folded neatly on the small table near the door. The heater was cold, and nothing suggested a guest had stayed there overnight. Calvin felt a brief wave of unease, but dismissed it as an unusual checkout. Some guests stayed only a few hours, especially those driving long distances overnight. He handed the key to housekeeping and continued closing out his shift paperwork. Later that morning, the manager reviewed the cash drawer and noticed a discrepancy. The payment Calvin remembered accepting for room 17 did not appear in the tally. Calvin opened his ledger and pointed to the entry, which was written clearly in his handwriting. They checked the computer system together, and no rental record appeared for that room during the night. The manager suggested the payment might have been logged under another room number or returned by mistake. With no receipt and no guest, the books were adjusted and balanced. Calvin mentioned the phone call and the heater complaint, but without a system record, it sounded like memory alone. The manager suggested fatigue might have caused confusion and advised Calvin to get rest before his next shift. The issue was closed as a clerical error. Calvin left the motel that morning feeling unsettled, but unsure how to press the matter further. Nothing concrete supported his recollection beyond the ledger entry and his memory of the call. Over time, the night faded into the background of many uneventful shifts. Years passed, and the motel continued operating with small changes in staff and procedures. Calvin stayed on the overnight desk and noticed that the far-end room was never assigned again. Housekeeping no longer referenced it, and maintenance stopped logging issues there. In 2019, the property prepared for sale and underwent a full audit of records and facilities. External auditors reviewed blueprints, occupancy logs, and maintenance files going back decades. Calvin assisted when asked, answering questions about overnight procedures. During one review session, an auditor asked about the numbering of ground floor rooms. The official list showed rooms 1 through 16, with no room 17 included. Calvin said there had always been a room 17 at the far end of the hallway. The auditor showed him original construction blueprints, which labeled that space as a utility access and sealed storage area. Calvin insisted he had checked guests into that room during his early years at the motel. The auditor noted the statement and requested further verification. Maintenance records confirmed the door existed but categorized it as non-guest access. The lock matched guest room hardware, though its serial number did not appear in the official registry. There were no housekeeping logs, maintenance tickets, or occupancy records tied to the space. Calvin walked the auditor down the hallway and pointed to the door. The number plate was gone, but a faint outline of adhesive remained on the surface. The wall paint around the door looked newer, as if it had been updated separately from the rest. Archived phone logs were reviewed next. They showed an internal call at 3:12 in the morning on the exact date Calvin remembered. The call originated from an extension associated with the utility area behind that wall. A retired maintenance supervisor was later contacted and said the space had been temporarily converted during a renovation in the early 2000s. He said it was used briefly during peak seasons and later reverted to storage without full documentation. He could not explain the missing payment. Calvin retrieved his old ledger from storage at home. The page from that night still showed room 17 written clearly. No other pages referenced that room before or after. The auditors photographed the entry and added it to the final report. The conclusion stated that the room existed temporarily but was never formally integrated into the system. The guest likely stayed briefly and left early, and the payment discrepancy remained unresolved. After the sale, the new owners sealed the door permanently. Calvin eventually left the motel and took a job closer to home. Sometimes he passed the building and remembered the night he checked someone into a room that later vanished from records. He never claimed anything beyond what he observed. To him, the story stayed grounded in forgotten paperwork and overlooked renovations. Still, the memory of a phone call from a room that officially never existed stayed with him. It reminded him that some places function briefly as real, even when history later refuses to record them. The audit ended quietly, and the sale moved forward without delay once the final report was submitted. Calvin was not contacted again about Room 17, and no one asked him to clarify his statements further. The issue settled into paperwork, where unresolved details often stayed without consequence. Several weeks after the new owners took control, Calvin noticed changes during his overnight shifts. Maintenance crews worked late evenings, repainting hallways and replacing fixtures that showed their age. One night, he walked past the far end of the ground floor and saw workers removing the door entirely. The opening behind it revealed a shallow space with exposed piping and wiring that matched utility access descriptions from the blueprints. The wall inside looked unfinished compared to the rest of the motel rooms. By morning, the opening was sealed with drywall and painted to match the corridor. The hallway felt shorter after that, and the far wall looked plain and uninterrupted. Guests never walked that far anymore, and no one asked about a missing room. New staff members learned the layout from updated diagrams that ended at Room 16. Calvin stayed on for several months after the sale, training replacement staff and helping transition overnight procedures. None of them knew about Room 17, and Calvin did not volunteer the story unless directly asked. He sensed that without records, the details sounded like a mistake rather than a memory. Before leaving the job, Calvin reviewed his old ledger one final time. The entry for that winter night remained unchanged, with Room 17 written clearly between other routine notes. It stood alone as the only reference to a room that no longer existed anywhere else. He placed the ledger back in storage and accepted that no further answers would come. The auditors had offered the most plausible explanation, even if parts of it felt incomplete. The space had been used, then erased through neglect rather than intent. Years later, Calvin drove past the motel while traveling for work and barely recognized it. New signage covered the entrance, and fresh paint masked the building's age. Nothing on the exterior suggested that an extra room once operated quietly at the far end. He did not think of the experience as mysterious in a dramatic sense. To him, it reflected how systems fail when temporary decisions go undocumented. A room could exist, serve its purpose, and disappear without leaving more than a trace in one person's memory. The phone call stayed with him most clearly. Someone had used that extension, described a heater problem, and thanked him for help. That moment felt real, regardless of what blueprints or databases later claimed. Calvin understood that places changed and records followed rules that reality did not always respect. What mattered was that the interaction happened, even if no official system agreed. The room had been real for one night, then surrendered to correction and paint. In the end, Calvin accepted that some details are lost not through secrecy, but through indifference. The motel moved on. The hallway stayed quiet, and Room 17 remained absent from every list. Only one person remembered walking towels down a corridor that no longer led anywhere. One cabin, one night, and a mistake no one noticed. One small cabin became the center of a quiet mistake that went unnoticed for years by everyone responsible for tracking it. The error happened during a single winter night, then settled into routine without raising concern. Rylan Moore was 41 years old and worked as a seasonal caretaker for a remote lakeside property owned by a regional utility company. The land contained several identical cabins used by inspectors and engineers during maintenance work on nearby power lines. Rylan lived close enough to respond quickly and handled keys, logs, radios, and basic upkeep during colder months. The property stayed mostly empty in winter. Only a few inspections were scheduled each season, and cabin usage depended on weather and access conditions. Rylan relied heavily on habit and handwritten logs, since digital updates were rare and procedures had stayed the same for years. In early winter of 2014, a routine inspection was scheduled to begin the following morning. According to the plan, 2 inspectors would arrive together at daylight and stay one night. Rylan prepared 2 cabins, stocked firewood, tested heaters, and updated the occupancy sheet kept in the small office. Late that evening, snow began falling harder than forecast. Wind pushed it sideways across the lot, and visibility dropped quickly. Just before midnight, headlights appeared through the trees, and a single vehicle pulled into the gravel area near the office. A man stepped out wearing a heavy jacket and carrying a small pack. He introduced himself as part of the inspection team and said he arrived early due to worsening road conditions. He asked if a cabin was available for the night. Rylan checked the occupancy sheet and saw no conflicts. Without hesitation, he assigned the man to cabin 3, which sat slightly apart from the others near the tree line. It was quieter during storms and had fewer heater complaints in past seasons. Rylan unlocked the cabin, showed the man the heater switch and radio protocol, and pointed out emergency supplies. The cabin looked normal, clean, and ready for use. Rylan handed over the key and a handheld radio, then returned to the office and logged the check-in time. Snow continued falling through the early hours. The property lights glowed dimly against the white ground, and the forest beyond stayed dark and still. Rylan completed his rounds, checked locks, and monitored the weather radio for updates. Around 2 in the morning, the handheld radio crackled to life. The man in cabin 3 reported that the heater worked but made a loud knocking sound when it cycled. His tone was calm and practical, like someone used to temporary lodging. Rylan replied that the heater was old but safe and said he would note it for maintenance after the inspection period. Heater noise was common in winter, especially during temperature swings. The man acknowledged and ended the transmission. After the call, Rylan wrote a short note in the margin of the log about the heater complaint. He had learned to write things down immediately, since details blurred after long overnight hours. The note sat quietly beside the check-in entry. He stepped outside once more and looked toward cabin 3 from a distance. Snow fell steadily, softening outlines and muting sound. No light showed through the windows, which did not concern him because many inspectors slept early before morning work. Rylan considered walking over to check the heater himself, but decided against it. The path was slick, and the complaint did not sound urgent. He trusted the radio contact and returned to the office, closing the door against the wind. Inside, the office heater clicked on and off, echoing the same mechanical rhythm described by the man earlier. Rylan listened absently while reviewing supply lists and next-day tasks. Nothing felt out of place or required immediate action. Before dawn, Rylan walked the property one final time. Cabin 3 showed no exterior lights and no visible movement inside. Fresh snowfall covered the ground evenly, making footprints impossible to distinguish from drifting patterns. Rylan locked the office as the sky began to lighten behind the trees. He believed the night passed normally, with one early arrival and a minor heater issue logged for later attention. At the time, there was nothing to suggest that assigning cabin 3 would become a problem. Only later would the routine details begin to separate from official records. What seemed like a standard check-in would slowly turn into a mistake that no one noticed until years had passed. Morning arrived slowly as snowfall eased into light flurries drifting across the frozen lake. Rylan woke after a short rest and returned to the office to prepare for the inspection team's arrival. Just after 7, 2 vehicles entered the property and parked near the office. 3 inspectors stepped out together, stamping snow from their boots and greeting Rylan casually. They thanked him for preparing the cabins and said the drive had been rough but manageable. Rylan asked which one arrived early the previous night. The group exchanged brief looks, then one supervisor said no one came ahead of schedule. According to them, all inspectors had stayed at a motel closer to town due to the storm. Rylan felt immediate confusion and said he checked in one inspector just before midnight. He mentioned assigning cabin 3 and receiving a radio call about the heater during the night. The The supervisor shook his head and said that did not match their timeline. They reviewed the schedule together inside the office. The printed plan showed all inspectors arriving that morning. No early arrival was noted, and no lodging was authorized for the previous night. Ryland opened the occupancy sheet and pointed to the entry in his handwriting. Cabin 3 showed a clear check-in time from the night before. The supervisor said the name listed belonged to an inspector standing in the room who insisted he arrived only that morning. They walked out together toward Cabin 3. Snow lay thick around the cabins, and the path looked undisturbed. When Ryland unlocked the door, the cabin felt cold and unused. The heater was off, the bed neatly made, and the firewood stacked exactly as prepared. The handheld radio Ryland issued the night before sat on the table, powered off. The supervisor said the inspector's radio had remained sealed in its packaging until moments earlier. No one could explain how the radio ended up inside the cabin. Ryland mentioned the heater complaint again, describing the knocking sound reported over the radio. The supervisor said maintenance logs showed no heater issues reported during the inspection period. At the time, the discrepancy was treated as confusion rather than evidence. With work scheduled and daylight limited, the inspection team moved on. Ryland crossed out the entry for Cabin 3 and corrected the occupancy sheet to reflect the official arrival time. No incident report was filed, and the matter was set aside. Cabin 3 remained unused for the rest of the season. Ryland locked it and left the key hanging on its hook, assuming the situation resulted from fatigue or miscommunication. Still, the radio call stayed vivid in his memory. Weeks later, maintenance inspected the heater in Cabin 3 and replaced a worn internal component. The report noted a knocking noise during operation but listed no reporting party. Ryland noticed the note but did not raise the issue again. As winter ended, the inspection season closed without further problems. The occupancy sheets were archived, and the crossed-out entry blended among other routine corrections. Nothing else called attention to that night. Ryland continued working the property for several more years. Cabin 3 stood unchanged, quiet, and intact, though it was rarely opened. Over time, its absence from schedules became normal, even to Ryland. He did not know then that the cabin itself no longer existed in official records. That detail would surface much later, long after the mistake had been absorbed into routine paperwork. Years passed without further mention of the incident, and Ryland continued his seasonal work without disruption. The crossed-out entries stayed buried among other routine notes that rarely received attention. Cabin 3 remained standing, unused, and gradually faded from daily consideration. In 2020, the utility company conducted a compliance review of all remote properties. The audit focused on fuel usage, maintenance costs, and occupancy records spanning several years. Ryland was asked to assist by clarifying older handwritten logs stored in the office. When the auditors reached the winter records from 2014, they paused at the crossed-out entry for Cabin 3. There were no corresponding fuel usage increases, no access badge logs, and no recorded radio traffic assigned to that cabin for that night. Ryland explained the events again, carefully and consistently. He described the early arrival, the radio call, and the heater complaint. The auditors listened without interruption, then compared his account to system records. One auditor pointed out that Cabin 3 had been officially decommissioned the month before that winter season. A boundary update changed how the property was classified, and Cabin 3 was removed from the active inventory. The structure remained physically intact, but it no longer existed in the system. Because of that change, any radio traffic from its assigned frequency would not have been logged. Fuel usage from the cabin heater would have blended into shared infrastructure readings. No badge access was required because the cabin was no longer considered occupied space. The auditors concluded that Ryland had unknowingly checked someone into a cabin that no longer existed on paper. Habit and unchanged physical conditions overrode updated documentation. The radio call, heater issue, and maintenance note aligned with that explanation. There was no evidence confirming who stayed in the cabin, and no evidence proving no one did. The cabin had been accessible, stocked, and functional for that one night. The mistake resulted from a system change that never reached daily operations. The report closed without assigning fault. The incident was categorized as an administrative oversight with no safety impact. The recommendation stated that all decommissioned structures should be clearly marked or removed. The following summer, Cabin 3 was dismantled. The materials were hauled away, and the site was cleared to match updated property maps. New signage reflected the revised layout, and future caretakers were trained using corrected documentation. Rylan left the job not long after. He accepted the explanation, even though parts of the night still felt unusually specific in his memory. He remembered the tone of the radio call and the ordinary nature of the complaint. To him, the mistake was not dramatic. It showed how routine and familiarity could override records when changes happened quietly. One cabin functioned for a night, then vanished through correction rather than secrecy. The crossed-out entry remained the only written trace. No incident report was filed, and no follow-up occurred. Only one person remembered unlocking a door that should not have been used anymore. For everyone else, Cabin 3 had never hosted anyone that night. For Rylan, it had, even if the system refused to agree.